Strong.Sistas YouTube channels, we've all heard the argument that red meat, in particular beef, is destroying the environment. Well, I'm honored today to be joined by Nicolette Niman, where we break down this argument to show that it is not necessarily true. So Nicolette was a environmental lawyer turned rancher and a vegetarian turned meat eater. So she has definitely done her research throughout the years and has presented a lot of these arguments in her defense for beef in Defending Beef version 2. So we're going to work through some of the topics she presents in Defending Beef, such as the issues with the current greenhouse gas estimates of livestock and animal production, cow burps, cow farts, and the methane emissions, and how cows are actually part of the solution to help us fix our climate issues. So before getting into the conversation, I'm just going to share a brief excerpt from her book here. I think it helps set the scene. We need to stop viewing cattle through the narrow lens of a climate problem like fossil fuel emissions that needs elimination or even mitigation. Instead, we should focus our energies on fully tapping into their unique superpowers. Domesticated ruminants can heal our damaged environment. They can draw carbon from the atmosphere back into soils, all while generating wholesome, nutrient-rich foods. If we want a slogan, perhaps it should be beef, bringing carbon back to earth. So before we get into this conversation, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button and check out Defending Beef version 2. Hope you guys enjoy. Hello, Nicolette. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Strong.Sistas podcast channel. I really appreciate your time. I know you have a lot going on, but I'm really excited to dig into some of the topics in your new book, Defending Beef. This is the upgraded version, which should be coming out. What's the exact date?
July 20th.
July 20th. So really exciting. Make sure you get your hands on one of these. But before we dig into some of the topics, can you provide my audience with a little bit of your background? I find your background so important, and it's really relevant to what's in this book, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Well, I actually am from the area near where you're living. I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan originally. And I was kind of a kid that was super interested in nature and spent a lot of time outdoors growing up. And actually, I spent a lot of time on farms because my parents were really interested in getting food from, directly from farms. This was like long before farm to table was cool. My parents were a little bit ahead of the curve on that one. But I didn't have a strong background in agriculture. I just had that connection of going out to farms and so forth. I majored in biology in college. I was always interested in the sciences, especially the natural sciences. And then I went to law school and I became a lawyer. And I first worked as a prosecuting attorney, and then I was working for a law firm in Kalamazoo, Michigan, actually. And I heard a speech by Bobby Kennedy Jr., who is an environmental lawyer and was at that time head of a group called Waterkeeper Alliance, which focused on water quality issues. And that kind of inspired me to pursue my passion, combine my passions in law and environment. And I ended up working for National Wildlife Federation, which in that job, I was working on water quality. So sort of trying to stop pollution to the surface waters, basically. And then I happened to have an opportunity about a year after I started working there to work directly for Bobby Kennedy at his organization in New York. And I decided to take that opportunity because that seemed like an exciting place to be. And it was, he's a very dynamic guy, and there was a lot happening there, and it was an exciting place to be. When I started that job, I was assuming at Waterkeeper, I was kind of just assuming I would be, continuing just working on water quality. But he asked me to specifically focus on the pollution from animal agriculture. And, I remember being kind of reluctant at first because I knew that meant like full-time focus on manure, which did not seem like all that glamorous. But I went and visited people living in rural communities in Missouri and North Carolina that were really affected by the pollution from large industrial scale animal operations. And that got me really motivated. Like, yeah, this is an important job that needs to be done. And I had already been on the city council in Kalamazoo, and, I had a strong interest in public issues and working on, sort of improving public life. And so it seemed like a good opportunity to do something really important and enjoyable and interesting. So I did that for 2 years. I was at Waterkeeper. And during that time, I got more and more convinced that just sort of opposing, large scale industrial animal agriculture, even though that was really important, that wasn't really exactly what I wanted to be doing, because I was more interested in sort of promoting solutions. And I had also had the opportunity to spend a lot of time on the farms of really good farmers who were doing things very well, and especially the Niman Ranch farmers. And I got to know Bill Niman, the founder of Niman Ranch, and I ended up marrying him, which was an unusual twist of the story, because not only, is he a cattle rancher and at that time he was the CEO of the meat company Niman Ranch. Um, and I was a vegetarian. So it was like a really unusual, union, but, love conquers all and all that stuff. So I moved from New York to California. And then, kind of to my surprise, I started finding myself really interested before I even started applying for legal jobs, which was what I thought I would be doing. I just was really interested in the ranch. And I just kind of started spending more and more time, helping out on the ranch. And I actually literally never applied for any jobs here, because I just kind of wanted to work on the ranch. And that I wasn't, expecting that to happen, but I sort of fell in love with that. And then um, became pretty much a full-time ranch hand. I would just, I'm not quite skilled enough to call myself anything more than that. I think I would be kind of in that category. I did that for about 7 years until our first son was born. And then at that time, we brought on more help because I just couldn't do everything that I had been doing. And I started writing books as well during that time period. And I wrote a book called Righteous Pork Chop, which was basically a critique of the industrial way of raising animals, but also an argument in favor of kind of regenerative farming and diversified farming, and the inclusion of animals in farming. And then a few years later, I wrote the book Defending Beef, which was really specifically focused on this argument that cattle are really important in the food system, both environmentally and from a food and health and nutrition standpoint. And then that book, that the first version came out about 5 years ago, and I did a lot of writing and speaking after that book came out about that topic. And I found that over the last several years, the topic actually was more, more in the news, and more people were discussing it. And so when Chelsea Green asked me to create a new edition of the book, I jumped at the chance. And actually, at first, I thought I would just kind of be updating a few things, adding a few studies. And then I started reading it carefully, page by page. And I realized that my perspective had evolved quite a bit since the first book came out. And also that there was a lot more information I wanted to include. So this is really a whole new book. I spent a year working on it. In fact, much of my time, during the pandemic has been spent working on this book. And so, in addition to homeschooling the kids because they, couldn't go into school. I mean, it's been a crazy year, as it has been for everybody. But anyway, I came out with, basically completely redid this book, and I'm very excited that it's coming out again. So that's kind of my background. I have this, I'm kind of trained as a scientist, trained as a lawyer, worked as an environmental lawyer, and then now I've been living on this ranch for the last 18 years. So I really consider myself primarily a mother, actually. That's probably my number one, that's where my time is mostly focused. But then I also work on the ranch and work on, writing and advocacy around animal agriculture, really arguing for meat as an important part of the diet and part of agriculture.
That's great. I think that your experiences give you such a unique perspective. Well, first, you have in this book, I have written down, you call yourself in the past a vegetarian meat advocate. So I think that's really cool, right? And you mentioned in the book that your first bite of meat in a long time was in 2019. But I think you have this really unique perspective where you were able to see firsthand the industrialization confinement operations, largely pork and chicken, and then complete opposite side of the spectrum of Niman Ranch and regenerative ranches, people doing things the right way. And so you've seen both sides of the perspective. Can you just touch briefly on your original reason why you were a vegetarian and what made you get interested in meat and change that view?
Yeah, well, I think I became a vegetarian I was not raised a vegetarian. I was raised in an omnivorous household, and my parents were actually kind of unusually interested in healthful eating. And my mom had a large garden. She's from Germany. And so she grew up in a place and in a time where, a lot of people still produced a lot of their own food. And that was kind of normal to her. So she used to bake breads and she used to have a large garden. And our whole family went out to the farms of southwestern Michigan a lot to get our own, we'd go and pick our own fruit. And we also had a lot of farm stands that we used to go to get vegetables. And we had this family that used to deliver our eggs from their farm directly. And so in that time period, that was kind of unusual. More and more people are doing that kind of stuff nowadays. But they had this very strong commitment to the idea that if you exercise and you eat well, that's kind of the core of good health. And that's still what I believe today, in fact more so now than ever. So I always had this idea that if you eat healthy food, that would be the core of being healthy for a lifetime. And I ate everything really until college. And then I was always very interested in the natural world and the environment, and became like, a childhood environmental advocate kind of thing. I mean, I didn't do anything really dramatic. I wasn't like Greta Thunberg or anything like that, but I was, had the Little Ranger Rick magazine, and I was going to the nature center a lot, stuff like that. But when I got in college, I got involved in, advocacy, and there was a lot of discussion about how, especially beef was deforesting the Amazon, essentially. Now that's an idea that I've kind of deconstruct in defending beef in some detail, and it's actually quite inaccurate. But at that time, that was one of the main forces. There was this idea that if you were a good environmental citizen, you shouldn't be eating meat, and especially beef. And then there was kind of also rising right around that same time, especially in the 1970s, the idea that saturated fats, especially from animals, is unhealthy. And I remember, again, I think I mentioned this in the book, I remember my parents saying, well, we really shouldn't have butter in the household, we should have margarine, and it's kind of funny because my parents, for the most part, I think we followed a really healthy diet and they were a great role model. But the one thing I think they went off wrong on, but it was kind of the prevailing norm at that time, was they decided we should switch from whole milk to skim milk, and we should switch from butter to margarine. And I don't think that's healthy anymore. But I think they were making, the best choice that they thought at that time. But anyway, I became, I remember when I stopped eating beef, freshman year of college, and because I thought it was the right thing to do from a health and environmental standpoint. And then a few months after doing that, I decided to just stop eating all animals, and I continued that diet for many years. During the years that I was working as an environmental lawyer, I was a vegetarian, and it to some degree just reinforced my thinking that being a vegetarian was the right idea. Although I was always struck when I was on these really good farms, these well-managed farms where there were a lot of, there was a lot of diversity and there was a lot of care for the animals and the land and the plants. And, I just kept thinking this is a totally different entity, than what I'm opposed to. And so I never got into the mind frame of thinking that all, animal farming is wrong. I never accepted that idea. And I think that's partly because I, grew up outside a lot and majored in biology. And to me, it's always made sense that essentially the human diet should be based on harmonious interactions with ecosystems, and that we should follow our evolution in terms of understanding what our physiology demands and how to provide that. And so even in the original Defending Beef, which I wrote at the time, I was still a vegetarian at that time, I said in there, I think the optimal diet includes meat, but I'm choosing not to do it at this point. I had it in my mind that someday I might return to meat, but it was 33 years as a vegetarian before I started eating meat again. And I think the reason I decided to eat meat again was I had already abandoned the idea that it was healthier or more environmentally friendly. If you're choosing well-raised meat, I just don't think that's correct at all anymore. But I was still eating a vegetarian diet, partly because it had been my diet for a long time. So there was a comfort element to it. But I think it was just a discomfort still of eating animals, that basic idea of, do I have to kill an animal to eat? And more, I started realizing, it was very strange. I remember when I took that first bite of that hamburger in 2019, and it was meat raised it was from our ranch. It was beef. It was my husband Bill had prepared the hamburger on the grill, and I thought to myself, oh God, am I going to take this bite and feel instant remorse? And it was almost the opposite. I just felt relief. And the reason I felt relief, I think, was because for quite a few years, I had realized I should probably be eating meat from a health standpoint, and that it would actually be more consistent with my beliefs and my ethics about, food systems and humans, relationship with the natural world and so forth. And yet I wasn't doing it. So in a weird way, I was actually, um, my diet was out of sync with my values and my beliefs. And when I started eating meat again, it got more in sync. And then, the food, it was strange. I grew up eating meat, as I said. So it was a return to a food that I was reared with and that I enjoyed, and that just felt really good to me right away to be eating meat. So as you said, that was almost 2 years ago now, and I've been really enjoying the meat. I have two young sons and my husband, and I cook every day at home here, and um, we eat really pretty much only meat that's from our ranch or from other farms and ranches that we work with. So we pretty much know where. I've literally never bought meat in a grocery store. We just, we know where all of our meat and fish. We get to get fish from our local fishermen that are here because we're right on the ocean. And so we know where it's coming from. We know the story. We know it's stuff that we believe is nourishing, and that and devoid of problematic contaminants and other stuff like that. But also we feel comfortable, from an ethical standpoint in terms of the production model. So it's been a long journey for me, but I'm feeling really happy about the fact that I started eating meat again. And I think I mostly did it because I had passed the 50-year mark in terms of my age. And I really felt like I wanted to grow old. I mean, not that I don't feel like I'm old now, but I'm beginning the point in my life where I have to think seriously about aging. And I want to be healthy, and not just okay, but really vibrantly healthy and strong as I go into those latter years. And that's my goal. And I think with a good diet and exercise, I have a good shot of, remaining very healthy. And, I'm healthy now, and that's my plan. I want to be strong going into and hopefully to the end of my life. So that, I think meat is going to help me do that.
It sounds like your story, you were like around the time you were in college is really when these incontrovertible truths, right, were present about the saturated fat and that beef is destroying the environment. And it's really easy to accept that at face value. It's like these target headlines that's just like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I'll incorporate this into my diet. And then it seems like during your period of time where you were working as an environmental lawyer, you started learning more and more. You started seeing these other farms that are doing things the right way. And then you learned more about the nutrition side of it. So it seemed like you just dug into the facts, right? And you exposed yourself to more and more what are the true facts. And it's just such a cool story that you yourself evolved yourself out of a vegetarian diet and discovered these truths. So I just think I don't know, that it's just a really cool story. And so if we could kind of get to, I think, a great starting point that defending beef is centered around. So where did this beef is destroying the environment, or what's the beef with beef and the environment? Where did that stem from?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, there was this body of evidence that had started in the 1950s and kind of grew a lot in the 60s, suggesting that saturated fat was bad for your health. And beef, and really the red meats have higher levels of saturated fats than, chicken and fish. That's why we are constantly told to, that that's healthier, which I really strongly disagree with now. But so there was that side of it. We were already kind of hearing from a public health, and, the doctors began advising people to cut back on red meat. And quite frankly, there was a big there was a big surge in red meat consumption around sort of mid 20th century too. So, and it's kind of interesting to analyze why that happened, but there was a higher level of beef consumption. So there's possibly, um, there was maybe a need for a correction there. But because I really believe in omnivorous diversified diets, but that being said, um, so there was a large decrease around after mid 20th century. Some of that might have been okay, but we got but the decrease just continued, and there's been a pretty significant decrease in red meat consumption for several decades now. And then there was this environmental argument that started rising, and I think really like Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moore Lapay was one of the types of books that was essentially saying beef is too resource consumptive to produce. It takes up too much land, in quotes. Again, really, that's a really questionable argument, which and we can talk about that for hours. But essentially it was the idea that it's an inefficient food to produce, that it's too consumptive, and that people in the Western world had an ethical obligation not to eat it because it was creating essentially hunger in other parts of the world, or maybe even within our own borders. All of that is really in my view a misunderstanding of how the world's food system works and how ecosystems work and how agriculture works. But that's the sort of fundamental basis. And I think and then you had books like Beyond Beef by Jeremy Rifkin, which basically said that everything that's ever bad that's happened in the world is due to beef. It's almost laughable. I was still an environmental lawyer and vegetarian when I read that book, and I was even as with that perspective, I was reading that book and saying, wow, this book is ridiculous. How could this have become a best-selling book? But there's just been, I don't know, I think because beef was the most consumed meat in the United States for decades, and because it's always been the most expensive meat, there's kind of a prestige associated with it. There's a kind of, there was a ubiquity to it. So there was something really sexy and attractive about attacking it and saying, actually, you think this is healthy? You think this is desirable? It's actually horrible. It's the worst thing ever, and so that kind of was like a catchy way to sell your book. Because you also had John Robbins' book, Diet for a New America. And you did all these books that basically said we should be vegetarians or vegans, but especially we should get rid of beef. And I pretty much read all those books, and they're extremely flawed in terms of their understanding of agriculture and food systems, and in my view, human nutrition as well. But that was what it all started with. I think 1970s especially, it really bubbled up. And by the 1980s, you had two separate groups of people. You had people that were quote unquote healthier eaters and cared about the planet, and they were avoiding beef. And then you had people that were like, you know what, that stuff is all nonsense and I'm just going to eat whatever I want, and they were eating a lot of beef. But unfortunately, those were the same people in many cases that were smoking and that were not exercising as much, and that were eating a lot of junk food and other processed food. So, and that whole, so you had this weird dichotomy starting, which Chris Kresser has written so well about, this whole sort of healthy user bias, he calls it, where essentially if you were a healthy eater, you would avoid beef. And that has affected so much, dramatically affected the outcome of so many of the studies surrounding health and diets, which is, so I talk about that quite a bit in Defending Beef.
Yeah. And then you also, so this, I think one of the biggest headlines that we've seen recently, which is for some reason still spread today, is that meat contributes to 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's like a really easy way for someone to be like, look, this is why you shouldn't consume beef, 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. Can you talk about why this stat is wrong? There's so many miscalculations and misreports in this. So can you touch on some of those?
Yeah, well, I'm actually kind of relieved when people use the 18% figure, because there's also that even more absurd figure, the 51% figure from the World Watch Institute, which was actually just and I described, that figure is absurd, and that was the whole basis for the film Cowspiracy. And basically, that was simply an analysis done by two environmental policy analysts, one of whom was an adamant vegan, and they were arguing against meat, and basically they they theorized that the global morbing numbers attributed to livestock should be even much greater. But that figure is quite literally a joke. Okay, so let's focus on this 18% figure, which is a credible figure, but it's not a very good one. That was really put out there by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the United Nations in the year 2006. And they wrote it, it was a group of people that worked together to produce the report called Livestock's Long Shadow. And actually the lead author was a man named, a German, I think his actual background is as an agricultural economist, but he's worked at the UN for a long time and he produces these kinds of reports. And I've met him a couple of times. He's actually come to our ranch in years after that report was written, but because he was working at Stanford for a while and we invited him to come here and he came. And then I've also met him in Germany at another event and had lots of interactions with him. And he's a very pleasant, intelligent, thoughtful man. But it's important to understand that he, wrote this report kind of with a perspective. And the perspective was that actually there's kind of a rising population in the world, and that meat. Here's what's really interesting about this report. He's an omnivore, and he believes that the world's food system should be omnivorous, producing animal-based foods. But this report has been glommed onto by many, many vegan organizations and advocates saying that we shouldn't have meat. But that's not at all what the report was intended to do. It was really intended to say meat and animal-based foods are really, really important to the world's food system. And so what we need to do is intensify the food system more, basically make it more industrial. And so he was arguing sort of against the grazing animals because in his view, that's a less efficient way of producing food. And to produce more meat and more animal products, we need to have more intensification. We need to have more confinement, more buildings and machines. And in my view, it's completely the wrong direction for the food system, right? But it certainly was not a report that was ever arguing for veganism. And so it's very ironic that that's kind of been the launching pad for so much of that advocacy. In any event, a few years later, the Food and Agriculture Organization re-evaluated that figure, updated it, and they reduced it down to 14.5%. And they also acknowledged in that updated version that if you considered carbon sequestration that was contributed, that was being triggered by animal agriculture, that total number might come down considerably. In fact, they even sort of acknowledged that it might be carbon neutral if you did that. But they said that we essentially can't do that because we don't have the ability to come up with a good number, a good figure for how much carbon sequestration is caused by animal agriculture. So we're basically not going to include it. And so it was really interesting. It was a kind of, I know you're a scientist, and so that, they were basically acknowledging that there was a huge gaping hole in terms of the accuracy of their figure, because there was a large consideration that might totally mitigate the figures that they were producing. And so it was a very interesting update to the 18% figure, because it not only reduced it to 14.5%, but it acknowledged that it could also be far, far lower or even zero. So that's kind of the background on that 18% figure. It really shouldn't be used at all anymore. It's not accurate. But as I explained in the book, there's a lot that's wrong even with that 14.5% figure.
Yeah, so let's just touch briefly on some of the things that they can. So I think an important thing for the audience to remember is all right, cows, even humans, all agriculture is going to emit greenhouse gases. There's no getting around that. And so this 18, which then they reduced down to 14.5%, is just measuring the emissions caused by cattle production. So that's going to be things like cow burps and farts, which we'll get into further in a little bit. So the methane, and then also feed production, so grain production, deforestation to produce grazing lands. What are some of the other transportation of the livestock?
And I want to correct you for a little bit there. The 14.5% figure and the 18% figure were actually estimates of all livestock's contributions, so all of the animals. So that's an important difference, because cattle, all of the ruminant animals, the grazing animals essentially, were the largest share of that because of this question of the ruminant digestive system, which we can talk more about,
Yeah.
that causes methane, but it was including all animals, all domesticated animals for food, and even including poultry and egg production and all that. Anyways, so but yes, here's the really interesting thing. When they released that 18% figure, they also put out a press release. It was not in the report, it was in a press release for the report that said, this is actually more than the transportation sector. And this is so funny. It's so funny the way stuff, especially in this modern age, right? How information gets amplified and transmitted. This is a great example of misinformation being amplified, because pretty soon after that press release was issued, Dr. Frank Mitloehner and other people, but especially he's a professor at UC Davis here in California in the School of Agriculture. He and some grad students analyzed the number really carefully and realized that it was incorrect, quite significantly incorrect. That if you looked at the transportation sector using a comparable methodology to what they had done for the animal sector, that the transportation number would be far greater. But they didn't do that, okay? They used one type of methodology for the animal agriculture, which made the number a lot larger. And then they just used a standard methodology for the transportation sector. And that's why that looked like it was bigger. But the authors themselves acknowledged that this was true. And so they withdrew that, statement and basically said, that's not correct. We were wrong. And yet that statement gets made over and over again to this day, even though it's now, whatever it is, 15 years later from the original report or whatever. So that was never correct. The transportation sector is a far greater emitter. And if you're specifically focusing on the figure that they created in this report, there are a lot of other problems with it. And one of them is that you referenced it a second ago, Ashley. They took land, what they call sort of land conversion, and they added that into the figure. Now, I understand why you would do that. What they're basically saying is, for example, if you had an area that was forested and then it gets cleared and burned, this happens a lot, especially it's happening in the developing world, and then cattle are being put on that, we're going to attribute that to animal agriculture. Now, there are so many things wrong with doing that it's astonishing to me that this very intelligent group of scientists thought this was okay to do. One of the things is that, first of all, that's not really the livestock. It's not really the cause of that. So I went through in defending beef, especially the new version. In the new version, I talk about this in a lot of detail. In Brazil, for example, which gets a lot of the attention about the Amazonian deforestation, the laws are such that if you have cattle on land, you can claim title to that, okay? So what's actually been happening with Bolsonaro as their leader, it's been much easier to do this, to take basically lands where indigenous people are living and move them off, forcibly. I mean, private entities are doing this because the government is allowing it and they're not stopping this from happening. It's not legal. They're not supposed to do this, but they're doing it anyways. And they're essentially clearing the land of indigenous people and then clearing it of the vegetation, especially the trees. And then they're putting cattle on it. And that's a way of creating title. And then ultimately the goal is to create soy fields. That's actually the ultimate goal. All right. And so there's whole nother level of irony about, vegetarians eating soy from unknown sources, right? And they are very possibly getting soy from these deforested lands that were, in this deforestation process. And the ultimate goal is that soy field because it's the most profitable thing. But cattle are a piece of that chain because they create title, ownership. And so, again, the story is far more complicated than what you get in the, that environmental brochure that says that beef are causing deforestation. So anyway, all of that kind of land conversion is being attributed to livestock in this report. And that's why the number was so much bigger than any other number that's ever been produced. The sort of, I think, much more credible estimate is that the whole world's agriculture, is somewhere around 10%. That's what it is in the US specifically. 10% of our global greenhouse gas emissions in the US are from all of agriculture. And the ruminant animals, so not just cattle, but sheep, goats, yaks, everything that people raise for food, that are ruminants, is around 2% of the total. And there was a really interesting, very scientific analysis a few years ago that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that said that if you took all of the animals out of the food system in the United States, you would only reduce our total greenhouse gas emissions by about 2%. And also, it said, interestingly, that you would have a pretty dramatic gap in the human diet. There wouldn't be enough availability of nutrients for Americans if you did that from our food system. So, and of course, we export a lot too. So we provide nutrition for other parts of the world, but even our own population would be pretty significantly lacking in really important nutrition. So I thought that was a super important point. This idea that there's so much attention paid to the animals in our food system with respect to greenhouse gases, but it's really not supported by the actual scientific facts as far as what the contribution actually is.
Yeah, I think two really important points out of that discussion. One is you were touching on like there's no getting around the nutrient density of animal products, and so if we removed all livestock production, what would we replace it with? It would require so much destructive agriculture with kind of nutrient poor crops, and so that's like an alarming thing to think about. What would be the increase in greenhouse gases by removing livestock production? And then the second thing that you brought up is that this FAO 14.5% report, they even admitted that there's this potential of carbon sequestration. And so for the audience, it's kind of like when you're calculating your profit, you have your expenses and your income. And so this FAO report was just kind of keeping track of the expenses of livestock production. But it even admitted, hey, it has this potential for income, meaning carbon being sequestered into the soil, but we don't know how to calculate that. So we're just going to push that aside. But there is
Exactly.
more and more science coming out about that because our technology and our ways of measurements to record this is improving. If you're interested, Dr. Jason Roundtree at Michigan State University is just one example. And then Nicolette includes a lot of the new references about this carbon sequestration potential in the book. Yeah. And so there's a lot of new science coming out that's changing the paradigm, saying that, hey, we can sequester more carbon. So if we take that 14.5% expense and then we factor in our income, hey, maybe we're closer to a smaller number or maybe even neutral. So I think that that's a super important point that is not talked about in the like vegan or vegetarian push side of things. So yeah, if you wanted to follow up on anything.
Yeah, and also another aspect that I talk about this a little bit in the book, but this is something that's really affected my own thinking a lot in recent years, and that is this whole idea that you can actually eat from your food region or your food shed pretty well if you include animal-based foods in your diet. So not just for the protein and the minerals and everything you need, the vitamins, but also for the fats. And I talk about it a little bit in the book, but I've also done other, I chaired a panel. This was so interesting. It's one of the most interesting things that I've ever been involved in. It was the Sustainable Food Trust, which is a UK based organization that I absolutely love. And they hosted a conference in San Francisco a few years ago called The True Cost of American Food. And they invited me to be the chair of one of the panels, and it was about fats. And this just blew my mind. Like I hadn't really thought about it much until I did this, but I put the panelists together and I worked with everybody beforehand, and then we did the panel, and it just changed my whole perspective. We put this group of people together that were experts on fats, including like Nina Teichholz, who's written that amazing book about fats. And we just had this amazing panel, and we basically traced how there's been this kind of anti-fat, especially anti-animal fat push within the sort of public health and medical community for several decades. And that was actually driving people away from, fats that were arguably even healthier than anything else you could replace it with from animals, but also that you can get like from your local food chain, right? And it was replacing it with basically industrialized forms of fats and oils from far away. And we looked at especially palm oil. And we looked indeed, we had a woman on the panel from Indonesia who has been working for many, many years against the creation of palm oil plantations in Indonesia. And she described in unbelievable detail and showed photos and stuff of what has been happening in her country, where they were creating, fats for the Western world. And it's just insane, that are supposedly healthier because we're now afraid to eat, lard and tallow and all these other sources of fats that we can get right here, from our own. And then the fats that we have in our local food systems and our domestic, American food system, a lot of them are being dumped into very cheap uses, industrial uses, pet foods, etc., rather than being used in our food system. For example, McDonald's used to cook their fries in beef tallow, and everybody who's old enough to remember that knows their fries were absolutely delicious,
I
even though they were, they were
yeah.
frozen and they were, still kind of processed food, but still they were tasty. And then they decided that that was unhealthy. And also there was, concern from vegetarian and vegan stuff like, well, we want to be able to eat that. We want to be able to eat that processed food, again, ironies upon irony. But anyway, there was actually an outcry of using animal products in the processing. So, but there was also primarily this idea that it was healthier. So they began using trans fats, vegetable trans fats to cook those in. And so just a great example of how the kind of absurdities that can happen when misinformation gets believed and transmitted. And so this whole push against animal foods, and especially animal fats, has led us down some really ridiculous pathways. And that's one. So there's the fats issue too, on top of everything else, on top of the protein and the nutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, and the secondary compounds. I know Fred Provenza, and that's another book that's just blown my mind, that, the nourishment book that he wrote, that maybe we're not even thinking about the right elements in food that we really need, right? But we go down these weird pathways to create healthier diets, and we're actually industrializing our diets more and more when we do that. I think that fats is a great example of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You kind of look at every processed food these days, and I guarantee you I can predict at least three of the ingredients.
Mhm,
Um, Vegetable oil,
mhm.
high fructose corn syrup, and like soy lecithin. And it's like you said, I think us, it all stemmed with like a health focus and creating this fear. And then I personally think that it just goes right in line with the huge shift in our farming practices. So going from grass-based operations to these industrialized, centralized systems. And
Yeah.
then these huge food manufacturing and meat companies have realized that this is incredibly more, like they get a lot more profit from this as opposed to small local farm based. And so they're doing everything in their power with lobbyists and creating policies to make sure that we move closer towards this industrial model, as we're all seeing with the like movement towards plant-based burgers, and like meat grown in a lab. And so it just seems like these things are running in parallel, where it started with this like you brought up Ansel Keys fake false like fear of saturated fat, and then companies started recognizing that they could make a lot more money by using these fake fats, vegetable oils, things like that, and replacing the local food system. And now we're seeing the repercussions of this experiment, both health wise. We are the only developed nation that has seen a decline in our healthy life expectancy in the last two measurement periods, and we are degrading our soil at an unsustainable rate. And so we'll now dig into a little bit more of the topics, but like this book, Defending Beef, Nicolette's argument is we need cows to fix this. So we are all in a dire state. We are eventually going to reach a point where our current food production system is unsustainable, and we will not be able to produce sufficient food that's nutritious for humans. And so if we don't make a shift, our fate is inevitable and it's sad. So in this book, she argues that like cows are part of the solution to fixing our human health and fixing our environmental health. Uh,
Yes.
okay, so if we can dig into a little bit more of the specific arguments that people make against cows, because cows is this easy red herring, this distraction from what's actually going on, which is the fossil fuel dependence from industrialization.
Yeah.
And so I think the biggest one would be methane emissions from cow burps and farts. So Nicolette, like, what is your response to when someone says, but cows produce so much methane and methane is such a dangerous greenhouse gas?
Yeah, so I dealt with it in the first book, but this is probably the biggest expansion that I did in the second book. I put a lot more into the methane discussion. In fact, my editor even said, "Wow, there's so much about methane. Maybe we should cut some of this." And I was like, "Nope, that's staying in," because I knew, because I'm sort of out there talking to the public and just about this issue all the time. So I knew this was a big issue. It needed to be really carefully analyzed and addressed. And I attack it through many different prongs, but the sort of the bottom line, get into the detail on this, but the bottom line, the sort of bumper sticker on methane is it's a red herring. Okay. If you're avoiding beef or any ruminant animals, lamb or any food product, coming from animals because of methane, just stop. Okay. It's ridiculous. Okay. Let me, there's so much to say on it, but I'll just break it down into a couple of categories. First of all, the way we measure methane. This is a really important point that I did not know about when I wrote the first book. And now I've learned a great deal more about. Essentially, and I'll say the primary person from whom I learned about this is a person by the name of Dr. Miles Allen, who's a professor, a physicist at Oxford University in England, extremely intelligent, knowledgeable, credible person who's been an expert on methane and was on the scientific advisory committee for many years for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is kind of the leading, they won a Nobel Prize for their work on climate change. It's kind of the leading international body on, advising governments on what they should do on climate change. So this is a guy, Miles Allen, was on their scientific advisory committee for many years. So he really knows this issue. And he has been making the argument publicly everywhere for years now that there's the measuring of methane is completely wrong. And he explains why in a lot of detail. And I go into a lot of detail in the book on this. But the sort of simple version of it is that methane lasts in the environment for a very short period of time, about 10 years. It breaks down in that short period of time. And there is a stock amount, we have a historic load of methane that's, sort of been there because a lot of different natural sources like swamps and, peat bogs, ruminant animals that were here naturally. We had huge numbers of ruminant animals historically on the globe, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so there's always been methane, and it hasn't had, we've had fluctuations in the climate, obviously, over the, millennia, but we've had a lot of, we don't have more domesticated animals on the globe right now than we had ruminant wild animals in the past. And there's been this historic load of methane that's been there for a long time. And it has fluctuated as well. But he basically says that because you have this continuous cycling of the elements of methane in the natural world, in the natural ecosystem, and it's continually breaking down, and it breaks down pretty quickly. He says, really, if you keep that load of methane stable, you don't really contribute to the global warming. It's not causing global warming. And he says this is in complete contrast to carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide that's emitted almost entirely from, sort of industrial human processes, especially fossil fuel production and burning of fossil fuels for, machinery and especially transportation and other things. That's a very different situation. That gas lasts in the atmosphere for over 100,000 years. And so that actually builds up. Every time you emit carbon dioxide, it contributes to this, greater load that's in the atmosphere. And so he says that actually these should be treated entirely differently in terms of a policy, approach to, how you measure it and how you treat it. And there's something called global warming potential, which is used right now, which basically equates these two things, GWP. It equates CO2 and CH4, which is methane, and says essentially, oh, well, this just has this much more, of an impact than this. And he says, actually, they're not equatable at all. And so he's developed a whole new metric called GWP asterisk. And he says that's actually scientifically correct. In the real world, the GWP measure works. And in the real world, the GWP asterisk measure works. The GWP measure, which is the existing model, does not work. And the fascinating thing about this, so it suggests that just like a cow that's out in a field is actually causing global warming. And he says, no, that's not true at all. If you have a stable number of cattle in your system that you're measuring, then there's no additional global warming happening from those cattle, because they're basically just releasing methane that is continually sort of maintaining the amount and then breaking down quickly. And so it's sort of a complex scientific question, which I try to explain. I give a bunch of equations, as my editor really thought I should take those out. I was like, nope, they're staying in there. People can skip past those if they don't want to, but I think it's really helpful to really explain it. Essentially, there's no increase in global warming from a cattle herd that's on the landscape unless you're increasing it in size. But that's one of the many pieces of the methane question that has not been properly understood. And when I talked with Dr. Miles Allen directly, this was so fascinating. I said, wow, your work has, I met him in England in 2019. And I said, this really breaks open this whole debate about cattle and methane. And he said, actually, it's really frustrating that there's so much attention on cattle, because it's ridiculous. Everybody knows it's about fossil fuels, and this is just a distraction. And he also said that all the scientists know that he's right, but there's resistance to changing it because it would have, quote, huge policy implications. So in other words, it would be really disruptive to the way people are approaching this issue right now, even though everybody in the scientific world who works on these issues knows that the current system is wrong. So I think this is a very important aspect of this whole question. And then there's a lot more to say about methane, but I'll say another key point is that we don't have, there's no parallel between the cattle herd and the amount of methane. Okay. And so there should be, right? There should be like rising numbers of cattle equals more methane. It's not that way at all. And you can look both internationally and domestically at, times when the one is going up and the other is going down. And people like Dr. Robert Haworth, who's at Cornell University and leads the methane project there, has been looking very carefully at the satellite data for methane all over the United States, especially, and I think all over the world. And he's shown that even some of the studies that previously linked cattle herd and methane amounts in the atmosphere were misattributing stuff that should have been attributed to fracking and then just natural gas production. And there was a very interesting article that just came out 2 weeks ago. I just read it, and it was brand new, about Europe and the methane emissions from natural gas production and leaks in the methane, of methane from the natural gas system in Europe. And it showed that there was this enormous amount that not only was not being regulated, but was not even being measured. And the amount was so significant, they had actually done some measurements for the first time of the methane leaks from the natural gas production in Europe. And the amount was so huge that it completely changed all of the estimates about where things were coming from. And the amount of methane that's coming from cattle is just tiny compared to all of these sources from natural gas, basically the whole industrial system, and especially fossil fuels, but other sources that are not being measured, not being regulated. And cattle are just basically an easy target. And you can say, oh, look, there's a cow on the landscape. And that's a scape cow, as my friend Stephen Zwick likes to say. So, it's really, it is totally a red herring, and people should just stop.
Yeah. I think the thing that really just like refutes this point is there were more ruminants on this planet previously than there are now. And so cows cannot be responsible for the rise in methane. when in reality, like you said, there's more and more evidence showing, wait, the rise in methane is actually due to these newer sources that we didn't have back then, such as fracking gas, coal bed gas, and actually nitrogen production. And so this is a really important article that I want to share, um, that industrial methane emissions are underreported. And so from the production of nitrogen, which is what the industrial farming system relies on, that's a huge increase in methane that no one is talking about because it would conflict with the current narrative. It would hurt the profits of these larger corporations. So this type of information, this was published in 2019 and it just hasn't gotten any press. Whereas still the narrative is the, oh no, it's the cow farts and the cow burps, because that's an easy story to tell. And like you said, it's the red herring. So I think hopefully we provided enough evidence that, like, okay, methane from cows, like that argument has to die. It has to go. She provides all of the references in this book. That's something I haven't touched on. Like, there are so many references that you included in this book to back up all of the claims that you use to defend beef.
Yeah, and my background is as a biologist and as a lawyer, and so when I put a footnote in the book, it isn't to somebody's blog or something. You know what I mean? Like, I really care about the quality of the information and making sure it's credible. The sources are credible. So I don't just have hundreds of footnotes in the back. Those are to very credible, um, peer-reviewed studies and other, really good primary sources. And yeah, there's a lot more to this methane story. We just sort of scratched the surface. I mean, rice in the late 1980s was believed to be the largest source of anthropogenic, oh boy, that's a tough one, this early in the morning, anthropogenic methane. And there has been reduction of the emissions from rice production because there was a focus on that. But the point is, I've never heard a single vegan advocacy group, or any advocacy group really, telling people not to eat rice because of methane concerns, right? So it just shows how people grab onto stuff and they use it to suit their narrative. And the anti-animal advocacy, food animal advocacy work, has very consciously and deliberately grabbed onto this climate change idea because they realized it was resonating with people. And so it started, maybe 15 years ago or so, and it's just gotten amplified and amplified more and more. And you have these prominent celebrities going vegan and saying this is because of climate change and so forth. And that just reinforces what's really a very, not just simplistic, but basically totally wrong understanding of the food system and of the science behind food production. Because Ashley, as you said, if you're not eating meat, you're going to be eating something else to replace it. And when you really look at that food, it's often, not only is it not as healthy as meat, which is a real whole food and extremely nutrient rich, but it's also generally going to be something that's a highly processed food and from an industrial source. So if you really trace that history of that food, it's going to be a much more problematic food, both from an environmental standpoint, and it's not going to provide you the same kind of nutrition. So it's not as good for your health. And that's it, it's frustrating in these days of sort of reductionistic information and the way people get information, and just everything's reduced down to a soundbite and super quick, simple ideas. But this is finally, my friend Russ Conser a few years ago on my Facebook page said, it's not the cow, it's the how. And I was like, oh my God, we have it. There's our bumper sticker. We finally have it. We can do that. And so, I have this great t-shirt that Diana Rogers made that says, it's not the cow, it's the how. And I think that is just the idea that just needs to be said over and over again, because if you're not eating beef, you're going to be eating something else. Okay. And so you have to compare it to that. And cattle have that enormous potential to have positive environmental effects. We've talked about carbon sequestration, but as you know, the book goes into a lot of other detail related to water, soil, biodiversity. There are so many positive implications to well-managed grazing animals that you actually cannot have from crop production. And so if you really dig into this issue, which I do in the book, you see that cattle are a really important part of creating, building a resilient and healthful food system.
Okay, so another argument against that, though, Nicolette, is people say, okay, I understand that regeneratively raised animals is better, but that's going to require way too much grass because for animals managed properly, it requires proper rotation and then letting that land rest and recover between rotations. So, what is your response to someone whose biggest argument is, well, converting our beef and livestock operations to regenerative models is going to require significantly more land?
Yeah. Well, on its face, that's a really good question. But again, when you sort of dig into the specifics of it, that really is in no way a barrier or an obstacle to this, to the conversion that I think we need to make as a world to a more grass-based food system. Because first of all, like for example, the Savory Institute, which is based in Boulder, Colorado, took this idea, but they work all over the world on grazing, and they just analyzed in the United States how much land it would take to completely convert all of the beef to grass based rather than having the feedlot system where they're finished and concentrated places with grain feeding and soy feeding and so forth. And what they found is that if you just use their kind of baseline estimates based on their experiences working with people around the world, as far as how much more you can actually produce off of land that's well managed, because there is a huge amount of, I mean, I'm both a critic of beef and a defender of it. And I would criticize a lot of the way grazing is being done today. We need to improve that. There's a huge room for improvement, a need to improve. And when you do that, and that's what the Savory Institute is really focused on, is helping people to do better grazing. And when you improve the grazing, you not only make healthier food and healthier animals, but you dramatically increase the health of the land and how much water is retained in the soil, and therefore how much vegetation grows and how much diversity of vegetation you get. And, all kinds of things, has all kinds of implications. They've even shown that where you have good grazing, you can actually return surface waters, streams and rivers that had gotten dried out from desertification will actually return. It's kind of extraordinary the things that have been done around the world with these good grazing practices. So the number that you would use as far as how much land you need and how much food you can produce off of it is not the status quo number. You would improve the grazing practices as you convert to grazing. And if you do that, you produce a lot more food per acre, essentially, from these grazing animals. Better managed grazing equals more production, pretty dramatic increases, in fact. And so if you did that, if you could, consider that as part of the calculus, you find that you have about 30% surplus of land that you would need to produce all the beef on grass. And I thought that was a great analysis that they did, just to show that that's kind of, again, another kind of red herring. We can't. And actually, here's another interesting point on this whole debate about food and how we produce it. Vegans often use the statistics, just like they did with the livestock's long shadow. They often use the statistics for people that are arguing for an industrialized food system to make their arguments. And so one of the things they've done is the sort of the grain finished beef industry has funded these analyses showing that supposedly, first of all, you can't produce all of the beef on grass, and then that it's more global warming intensive if you do, and so forth. And these studies are, they're incredibly flawed on a number of different levels, but it's really been the grain finished beef industry that has argued for intensification of beef production and argued against grass production. But the Savory Institute is not funded by the grain beef industry, and they have looked really at the land and the potential for grazing, and they've said that's not true. And I've also I cite in my earlier book, Righteous Pork Chop, as well as the current book, there are analyses that have been done about the world food system and just whether or not by these sort of European think tanks and stuff, and they try to look at all the land and what it's being used for and what it could be used for and so forth. And they've shown that you could essentially get rid of all of the industrial animal facilities and return animals to grass, and even go totally towards organic production and still have produce enough for the world's food world food system, the demand, to meet the demand.
You
So I
bring
think, people use these, make these claims, like this claim, like that we couldn't possibly do this because we don't have enough land, but they never have any facts to back themselves up.
Well, you bring up a really great point is that a lot of these studies are done by feedlots and large meat corporations because they don't want people to push regenerative agriculture and having grass-based operations because that works against their profits and works against their system. And so if you actually look at where a lot of these claims are coming from, some of them are coming from these confinement operations or these feedlots, and they want you to think that way. So that way you think, oh, this like centralization of animals is more efficient and we can produce more food in this smaller area. But then people miss out on the point that you include the source in this book that we produce enough food worldwide to feed 1.5 times the population. We don't have a food production problem. We have a political and social issue about food distribution. So
Right.
no, production is not our issue. And like you said, the Savory Institute has ran these calculations showing, hey, we can actually be grass-based. And that's one of my favorite chapters of the book. All food is grass. And I think there's a great argument in this book that like the best path for our future is returning our farming back to being grass based, which it was before the industrial revolution or this like green revolution that happened after World War II.
Right.
And so returning back to grass, and we do have the potential to do that. Another great example is Gabe Brown, who implements integrated crop and livestock. So much of our thinking now is like that crop and livestock production has to be separate when in the past it was integrated, and we can return to that where we can produce crops and cows on the same land, just rotating them and integrating them together in a regenerative manner. I think just a lot of these like important nuances get lost because honestly, Nicolette, I think it's a little bit complicated for some people to understand and comprehend. And so these like simplified messages are easier to just like mass spread.
Yeah, and I think, and speaking of complexity, Gabe Brown, who I just think is an incredible person and has created, and I love his book Dirt to Soil. I highly recommend it to anyone that hasn't read it already. In fact, I was chairing a panel that he was on, and so I read his book and I thought, oh, I'm going to know all this already. And I was just fascinated by it. I could hardly put it down. It was such a great book, and I recommended it to my husband as well. Who has been practicing all this stuff for decades, but I still thought there's a lot here for you to think about and to learn from. It's a wonderful book, but he's basically arguing that the complexity is such an important part of the system of making agriculture truly regenerative. And what I really like about Gabe Brown's work is that he emphasizes the importance of animals as part of that complexity that is trying to mirror nature. And he feels that cattle in particular, but other animals as well, are essential to regenerative agriculture, that you can't have this simplification of your system to the point where you're raising one thing and you don't have the animal impact on the land, because he says that that's absolutely essential for regenerating soil health. And he's found that essentially the more animals he has in his system, the more biological life he has in his soil, which is kind of the generator for the whole system. And so you have this question over and over again, well, can't we do, even people that are kind of interested in regenerative agriculture, but they don't want to eat animals, kind of say, well, we don't really need animals, or we could have animals in the system but not eat them, which I can explain for hours about why that doesn't work. Because basically, short answer is economics. But also, it's once again this idea that we start from this perspective that it's wrong to eat animals. And I really don't think that most people believe that. I think that most humans in the United States today, and certainly throughout the world, believe that it's okay to eat animals as part of their diet. But what they don't like is they don't like thinking that what they're eating is destroying the environment, or is unhealthful, or is cruel to animals. And so that's why I argue, I'm a very strong advocate for having the animals in the food system, but I'm also an advocate for doing it a better way than what is now the norm.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's a good point next point to go to. Nicolette, where do we go from here? So I would say one of the things that you bring up in the book is, like you just said, it's not the cow, it's not, or it's not the cow, it's the how. And I would say it's kind of the same thing with like chicken and pigs as well. The real, it's not the biggest issue that we're facing like environmentally, but a huge issue is confinement operations, because it just goes back to this whole centralization and industrial food system, where we're producing food as efficiently as possible at the cost of human health, animal health, and environmental health. And so these large confinement operations with chickens and pigs, which can honestly get worse than beef feedlots. So how do you view where we can go from here to benefit the health of humans, benefit the health of the animals, and benefit the health of the environment in a way that's like actually reasonable?
Well, I think one important thing is to think each of us has a lot that we can do for our own choices on our diet. And I encourage people to do that, and especially really to just start one step at a time, to not get overwhelmed by, God, there's just so much wrong. I'm just going to throw up my hands and give up, right? Because there, and my husband and I talk about this constantly, because there's a lot of like mislabeling and cheating, in the food system, and because it's not very well regulated. There are a lot of ways that people cheat, and actually he's spending a lot of time nowadays. He's been developing a testing system for that slaughterhouses can use, and restaurants can use, and retailers can use to test meat and make sure it's actually what it's supposed to be. And that's actually a lot of the work that he's doing now. But at the same time, we're always worried about cynicism and people saying, oh my God, there's just so much, forgery and faking, and I'm just going to just buy the stuff at the grocery store and give up. you know, and I think there's kind of a temptation to do that. But I think the best approach is to just say, I'm going to try to seek out better foods one thing at a time, or one source at a time. And I always use the example of eggs. I think eggs is a great thing that where you can seek better eggs. And I'm kind of fortunate here. I live in this little town where we have tons of people with backyard chicken flocks, with hen flocks. And it's very, very easy to get pasture-based eggs. It's not as easy everywhere, but it is doable. If you look around, you will find a pasture-based egg source in your community, and then you will begin to care more about that, because you'll realize it's not just a healthier food and it's a tastier food, but it's also something where if you know the person who's producing it and you develop a relationship with them, you want to begin to support their operations. You start purchasing it. So I feel like that's just one example, but it's a great little kind of gateway into beginning a journey where you're seeking out better sources for your food. But I also want to emphasize that I think it is not up to each of us to remake the food system. We can contribute to it. We can try to find better food for ourselves and our families. But we need policymakers on the state and national and international level to support regenerative agriculture in a lot of different ways, through I mean, we're subsidizing agriculture in a massive way in this country, and I don't oppose the idea of doing that. But what we're doing right now is we're actually in sort of endorsing with our public dollars and reinforcing this industrialized system. So I think the agricultural subsidies should go towards regenerative agriculture, and we should stop allowing, industrial agriculture to pollute our waterways, and to, for example, overuse of antibiotics is still allowed. That was outlawed in the European Union, a decade ago, and actually more than a decade ago. But anyway, a long time ago, and we still allow that here. So we let these massive industrial animal operations continually feed and put in the water antibiotics so that the animals don't get sick. Well, that's actually creating antibiotic resistant pathogens in the wild areas around those places, and also it's appearing on the meat, and it's in the water systems. So it's causing pretty significant public health threats and contamination to the environment. And we're just allowing this to happen by making it's legal in the US to do this. So this is an example of the kind of a federal law that should be adopted. It's been reintroduced in the US Congress for over a decade, and it still hasn't been passed. And that's the type of law that could level the playing field for the farmers that are not relying on continuous addition of antibiotics to their feed, like our operation, and all the farmers and ranchers that we work with do not do that. And so that makes, that gives them a competitive advantage that they really shouldn't have. And that's the kind of law that we need. So there's a complex solution to this problem, but we can do a lot to make the food system healthier and more ecologically sound. And we just need to take one step at a time, start attacking this problem. And it's not, we haven't talked about this yet, but it's not, food eating should not be a chore.
Yeah.
Eating is one of the greatest sources of joy. Certainly it is in my life, and my whole family. I mean, we look forward to the meals. We talk about what we're going to cook. We talk about, my 12-year-old son and I realized recently one of our favorite things to do is go to the grocery store together or go to the farm stand together, because we love looking at and thinking about the food and how we're going to create delicious meals together from it. And I know food isn't as important to everyone as it is to me. But I know for sure that eating a delicious meal is a pleasurable experience for pretty much everyone. And so I think one of the things to think about too is not just about health, not just environment, but about the joy that you have in food and the pleasure you can get from it. And the joy that comes from sitting around a table with friends and family, sharing a really good meal, especially where where it comes from, which really adds to the enjoyment that you get. So I always want to remind people that that's part of the story as well.
Yeah, I think neither of us are saying that like confinement operations are a good thing. They're ultimately a part of this industrial agriculture system, which includes monocropping corn, soy, and our tax dollars are going towards the promotion of destroying our soil to produce those cheap and abundant foods with no nutritional quality. And our tax dollars are also going in helping these confinement operations, because a lot of that corn and soy is being used for livestock feed, and then the animals are just sitting in these cages being fed the feed. So no one is arguing that any part of that system is good, and it needs a lot of change. And like you said, I'm also a proponent that I think that there needs to be policy change, and we have the new farm bill will be, I think, 2023. So we have a few years to kind of start to get the message out there that we want a more transparent system, because our current food system, it's so hard to know what's in our food. Like you said, all of these beta agonists, hormones, antibiotics, the pharmaceutical company, 70% of vaccines and antibiotics go towards livestock. And so the pharmaceutical company has a big incentive of keeping these drugs and external inputs into the livestock operation, because they make a lot of money on it. So they have a lot of lobbyists in Washington promoting it. Whereas if you contrast this, you bring up the example in Sweden, where the beef producers themselves said, hey, we don't want to allow any of this to happen for transparency in the market. And so it's a completely different system. And we're we walk into the grocery store and it's really hard to know where our food is coming from. So if I could just read a few lines from your book, I think they're great parting messages. And I really think they bring the whole discussion full circle. So Nicolette says, answering the question, am I eating food derived from an animal, tells you very little. It says nothing about what impact production of that food had on the animals, plants, and fungi coexisting in that farming ecosystem. All farming, and especially crop farming, kills animals of various shapes and sizes. The more meaningful question is, has this food been produced as nature functions? For me, it's clear that sort of farming involves animals. I think that is the mindset that we need to have as consumers, and really push that message. Know your local farmer, know where your food is coming from, and one consumer by the next consumer by the next consumer, we can start to make an impact with what we want and the transparency that we want in our food system. So, yeah.
Yep, I love that part of the book. So thank you for reading that.
Yeah. So do you have any more parting messages for the audience?
I guess I would just say, I think, I think of this whole question of how we eat individually as a journey. And I think each of us can, and we change throughout our lives in terms of what we like and what our bodies need. And I just really encourage people to think about what they're eating, what they're buying for their families, how much fast food they're eating, and really think of, you know, food as a source of health and joy, and to try to sort of one food item at a time, like I said, work on making food a more important part of your daily life, because we actually spend a great deal less money on our food than we did historically, and a great deal less time in preparing our food. And so I think the more we cook, the more we seek out good ingredients, it's going to really enhance our lives and our daily enjoyment of our lives. I actually saw, it was one of the interesting things about this pandemic. There was a lot, everybody kind of slowed down. You were sort of forced to slow down, and it allowed all of us, and I saw this happening all over the place, especially like on social media. I saw a lot of people talking about how much more cooking and baking they were doing, and how much more local sourcing they were doing. And I'm hoping this is going to be a kind of a reset point for a lot of people in terms of how they're eating, because I think that will provide people, just a source of pleasure in their daily lives, and a source of sort of centering and grounding, and long-term health benefits, I think, will come from that. So let's kind of, one step at a time, embrace the pleasure of eating and cooking and sitting down together over a meal. And that's a lot of the message of defending beef.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Nicolette. Again, this book should be live to purchase. So this is the revised and expanded edition. Like I said, it includes a ton of references to support why beef is a very important part of the food production system, and why the future of our human health and the environmental health requires properly managed livestock, especially cattle and ruminants.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Bye.